My D&D takes your D&D's lunch money every single day. Hello everybody, welcome to RPG Boons, where we talk about everything RPG and how everything is RP. My name is Don Franco 3, the busy person's GM. Today we're going to discuss why old timers say that old school D&D is a lot more grittier and tougher than current editions of Dungeons and Dragons. So over 30 years ago, I started playing Dungeons and Dragons. I happened to be stepping into a thrift store with my mom at the time, and lo and behold, I look down and there's a bag full of this guy, and this guy. I started playing D&D prior to having these books, but that was the first time I collected the books for myself and was able to play the game with my brother, essentially most of the time, and a few other friends when they could come in to play. The one thing I've started to notice these days, there's been a movement to move back to playing the old school style of Dungeons and Dragons. The reason I think is because the very first few editions of Dungeons and Dragons were kind of more reality based. Reality. And since then, things have kind of gotten out of hand. The more and more movies have become flashy, heroes having powers of very significant kind, altering the reality of the world. In order to keep the people happy, or at least what they thought the people wanted out there, they decided to make their characters stronger and stronger, giving them more and more abilities, essentially creating these superhero type medieval fantasy warriors. People decided that your heroes need to become more and more distant from reality. Take Superman, for instance. Superman clearly, when you first see him appear back in the very early 1900s, he looks more like an average man, maybe a little stocky, definitely in shape. And over time, he's became more muscular and more muscular. What we're looking at here is Superman easily picking up a car and being able to throw it. And that was pretty much who he was, a very strong individual, superhumanly strong, and we had the ability to toss cars like nothing. Now, what has happened over the last 100 years, essentially? This man, who was very strong, definitely already superhuman, over the years has acquired more and more abilities. For some reason, we've had to give him x ray vision. We had to make him invulnerable to everything. Then we started making him fly. Then he started shooting lasers out of his eyes. And in 2015, even though he was nearly indestructible, they decided to give him this other power called super flare. Now, I think this is a trend of what's been happening these days as well. If you take a look at old school D&D versus new school D&D, there's a clear difference between how powerful and how likely you were to survive in the old school D&D versus how likely you were going to survive and the level of powers you're going to get in 5th edition. Just as an example, I want to look at some of the classes in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons of the 1st edition and compare those to the 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons just so you can see what I'm talking about. What we're looking at here are 3 old school classes from Dungeons and Dragons: the Fighter, the Ranger, and the Magic User. If you look at the hit dice for the Fighter, it's 10, for the Ranger, it's 8, and for the Wizard, it's 4. If you add up all those hit dice plus the potential bonuses you're going to get from Constitution, the Fighter's going to have 143, while the Ranger is only going to have 116. And if you look at the Magic User, which is essentially a wizard, it's going to have a maximum hit points of 70. In addition, there was more restrictions back in the day. Paladins had to be lawful good. Now they can be whatever they want. There's other class restrictions that I won't get into, but there was also restrictions on multi-classing. Now, if we look at the current status of these 3 different classes, the Fighter and the Ranger now have the exact same hit dice. And if you look at the total hit points they can get, that's 280 for them. If you look at the Magic User, aka the Wizard, total hit points they can get is 200. Now, if we look at some of those restrictions that we saw previously, remember you could only get about 11, 12 hit dice in the previous editions, but now there's 20 levels, so you can get 20 hit dice. The Constitution bonuses were very restricted, but now anybody can have those Constitution bonuses. It's giving you that plus 80 for hit points. There's unrestricted class options, meaning you can be any class that you want, regardless of alignment, regardless of race. In addition, it's easier to multi-class. You just need a minimum score. In AD&D, there was more restrictions in terms of how you can combine certain types of classes with each other, as well as the races that you had to be in order to get that multi-classing ability. When we look at the cover of the player's handbook, you can clearly see one single sorcerer, appears to be a sorcerer, jumping and attacking a frost giant. Just that kind of stuff did not happen back in the old school D&D. If your players went up to a frost giant and tried to fight it, it was very likely that they were going to die. Unless somehow you managed to get to higher levels, which was very, very difficult to do. Now we're in a phase where basically you can be a single player and wipe out a giant all by yourself, or even a pretty large squadron of soldiers. D&D from the point of view of an old person has changed so much over time. So essentially we've gone from a more Middle Ages realistic style of fantasy game to more of a superheroic style kind of fantasy game. This is why when you talk to older players, they always say that D&D these days is just not realistic. It's a little sugar coated, it's really easy, and it's not as dangerous as it used to be. So it's really up to you. When you start thinking about your Dungeons and Dragons games and you feel like maybe your players are a little overpowered or there's too much magic in your world, and you would like things to be a little more grittier, a little bit harder for your players, or just to make it a little bit more pleasing for you, there's something you should really think about. Let me tell you a not so big secret. And hold on. Come here. Come here. Hey, Watsy. This is for DMs only. Watsy, corporate crap. We are the resistance. Hey, Watsy. We are the rebels. Trick those players. You know those people who don't really know what D&D is? Trick them. Tell them it's D&D. They don't know. They don't know the difference. Bring them. Bring them. Pull out that Shadow Dark. Pull out that Knave. Whatever you want. And call it D&D.